Second one, also as the dust settles and this becomes a regular occurrence, becomes more and more clear what the motive is. Remember last time we speculated around, is it punishment of those not compliant? Is it helping Trump for some, as of yet, undefined excursions into the Middle East, or may keep him happy? No, it seems to be clear. It is preparation of the ground for the fact that demand will fall short of expectations. There's too much spare capacity in the system, and it is becoming a game about market share now. And that is going to be very interesting then, if the global economy falters to the extent that we really see a drastic shortfall of demand that could well bring forward a situation similar to peak oil, in which defending market share only is possible at the expense of somebody else because the market is shrinking. And that means into a maybe slow motion, but still in effect a price war, with prices coming severely under pressure over the medium and long term. But that seems to be the game. Kazakhstan before pretty open that they wouldn't comply. Russia in the decision apparently, or they let it be known that they would have preferred tighter policies and higher prices to price. But Saudi Arabia firmly on course now, I think since April, to put themselves into a better position for the situation in which we have balances going up and suppliers coming under pressure.
Let's welcome Daniel Witt, President of the International Tax and Investment Center. Dan, thank you for joining the Daily Energy Market Podcast, and specifically today from Kazakhstan, of all places, the big OPEC plus offender, at least it appears on the headlines nonetheless. Your thoughts, looking again, month in review, the big decision again by OPEC plus yesterday to proceed with accelerated output increases. This is now an embedded strategy, and at least on the surface of it, Kazakhstan getting a lot of the blame as the sort of biggest violator of not conforming with existing output cuts. Your thoughts on the decision and the role of Kazakhstan within it?
Well, I think this will be greeted warmly in Kazakhstan. I'm here for the Astana International Forum, and I have to say, if people haven't been to Astana, the transformation since they moved the capital here in 1997, I sit here and look out my window. I was in that Congress hall. I felt like I could have been in Dubai or Singapore. And that's been possible from the petroleum revenue. And so petroleum revenue is critical to their budget. So I'm not sure it's a marketplace share. I think it's, they need to keep producing even at a lower price to feed their budget and their development program.
Just on that point, Dan, is it a choice? A lot of the reporting is that, Kazakhstan doesn't have a choice because they have committed contracts with foreign companies and they can't just renege on them. Is that accurate?
That was my next point. Who are the big producers here? It's Chevron, it's ExxonMobil, it's Eni, it's Shell. I think there's enormous pressure on the side of the operators and investors in those three big production sharing agreements. And don't forget, China has a lot of interest here as well.
And those together sort of restrict Kazakhstan's sort of role as a partner within OPEC Plus to conform, or is it still a choice that they make?
I think there's several, multiple wives, if you will, in this relationship, even though that's been outlawed many years ago in Kazakhstan. We never see behind the curtain, but I know that in discussions on tariffs, the fact that they didn't squeeze the operators was a piece that was put on the table on maybe you should reconsider the 27% Liberation Day tariffs. We are a good partner. This is yet another example of how we are a good partner.
Christoph, just taking that point, the sort of Liberation Day tariffs, and of course everything sits within that context as well. This month of May that has just passed was the second month of the sort of Liberation Day strategy, which started and then was suspended. So we're still in the suspended window of the reciprocal tariffs, but still they generate a lot of headline noise, as they did last week again, with the apparent breakdown in Chinese-US sort of détente around their suspended tariffs. How big a factor is that, do you think? Are these, you mentioned that OPEC plus strategy is now clear, it's a market share one. Is that just some coincidental parallel corridor to the tariff trade war that's going on in the wider world? Or how are those two things interconnected as you look back, and that the last month has given us some guidance on? They're connected, or they're just separate and coincidental?
They are connected, and they are connected in two major ways. Whether that's a coincidence or not, I don't know. The big broad way in which they're obviously connected is the impact of Trump's policies on global economic growth and therefore on oil demand. And that story is quite straightforward. I mean, what we are seeing now is this incredible back and forth in tariff negotiations. And I tell you, of all the news coming out every day, about what happens in Washington, the little piece which worried me the most came recently when it became clear, after some journalist asked him, that Trump apparently had not been told by his advisors about the phrase of the taco trade. Now, Trump always chickens out, so that he makes a big announcement, stock markets plunge. As an investor, you buy because he chickens out and takes it back. He was going mad at the question, of course, but it became clear, credibly apparently, that he wasn't being told about that. And he thought it is a good negotiation tactic, but it wreaks havoc with planning and with people's reactions. And then something we can talk about later. This is now only the first part of the big drama. The second part is going to be his tax passage. So his tax package. So first link to OPEC policy is that it becomes clear that there's now an increased risk of global growth turning sour, and therefore having decided that you go for market share, you rush to the exit. You want to be the first one who is at full capacity when demand goes down, and you want to do this now as long as the going is still good. So if you give up basically on the expectations of being able to hold prices up very high, then it makes sense to be the first one at the gate and say, okay, we produce flat out. And that's how this our trouble will start, I would predict. The other way in which it is connected is more indirectly, is that of course, Trump has made it abundantly clear that he thinks low oil prices are a good thing, regardless what his own industry says to that. And producers play to that tune. And I'm sure that for the Kazakh government, they can now say that we are not holding prices up. We don't renege on our contracts. We and our American partners produce as much as we've promised to produce, and so on and so forth. I think that probably also the Gulf producers will have told him when he's there, look, we are not the bad guys here. We don't bring down the global economy. They won't have to believe that to you, but they will have said we will not do it. And that's the indirect ways in which it links to each other. None of that is sort of a conspiracy at all. All of that is reactions to the policies of the Trump administration.
Dan, your thoughts on that as well, as we look at the month behind us, the 2 months, if one wants to go further, of this tariff strategy, this what is defined in some senses a suspended trade war with China. What was the most notable development of the last month that you take away as we sit here on the 1st of June?
Well, I think the way to describe it is tariff whiplash. Let's just take last week. Last month is a long time. Just last week, holidays, the markets were closed, but they announced that they would be accelerating negotiations with the European Union. Equity markets climb. But yet the next day, the International Trade Court, a little known body that was created by President Reagan in 1980, when we were worried about Japan taking over the world, unanimously, a decision of 3 judges, said that these Liberation Day tariffs are void, and they're against I wouldn't say Constitution, but it exceeds the presidential authority under the International Emergency Economic Protection Act 100-year-old act that he cited that supports the tariffs. And it was interesting. The court said, we've had trade deficits for 49 years. How can it be an emergency now? Well, then on Thursday, the federal appeals court for the DC circuit in Washington put these on hold. So the trade court said you can't do it. The appeals court put it on hold, and it'll ultimately go to the Supreme Court. So it's very hard to predict the future. And as we talked over the last couple of days at the Astana International Forum, the middle corridor, whether you call it the new old Silk Road from China to Europe, pipelines, or even now some feasibility study for a tunnel under the Caspian Sea, tariffs are driving this.
When we take that sort of decision last week, and again, the whiplash of the trade court suspending his authority to be the czar of all things tariffs, and then the federal court reversing that and giving him authority back to the president to continue with his tariffs. And this sort of whiplash is the latest episode in the whiplash of the last 2 months. Where do you think, Dan, the most obvious impact that will have on economic activity within the US? Because generally you'd say the headlines are US economy has been holding up.
Agree. And it was interesting last week, for the first time, I think in 5 months, the Consumer Confidence Index made a significant jump positively. I think President Trump is committed to tariffs. So one of the instruments he used to underpin his Liberation Day was that 100-year-old Emergency Powers Act. But there's also the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and Section 232. That was the weapon of choice in the Reagan administration to go after Japan on automobiles and steel. And then there's Section 301 of the 1974 Act. So if this is struck down under the Emergency Powers Act, there are other acts that could be used. So I think tariffs and the wish for tariffs by the president will continue, but it's an instrument in negotiations. And I saw that Oval Office interview on my iPhone, the taco, and he gave, he wasn't upset, but certainly annoyed, and gave the reporter a lecture on negotiations. And it has worked. You make a ridiculous offer, and then you get a counter, and then you start to talk.
But it's hard to know if it's worked, has it, Christoph? It's hard to know because there's no obvious, you can't point to the UK trade agreement as some kind of success. There was some fudge deal of which there was little detail or substance. The China one is suspended. EU, there is no Exhibit A, this strategy is working, is there?
Not yet. I would agree with Dan in that at the end of the day, we will see at least some token tariffs. But I would agree with you that it will be more of a token than it. If Trump's whole history is one not only of making a big statement and then negotiating and coming out on the better side, is one of making a big announcement and then coming home with nothing and selling that as a great success. So if that is a model, then we will have some tariffs, but they will be moderate, as long as the rest of the world sort of sticks together. And so far, you're right, it's only the UK who have caved into that. But the danger is elsewhere. The real danger of this is in the linkage of the external damage this does, this whole tariff discussion and isolationism, and what it does to demand and to growth, and the linkage to the fiscal deficit, which is emerging out of his big, beautiful tax bill. If that mobilizes, if that drives up interest rate, if that brings down bond prices, then there will be a real problem emanating from the center, from the financial center of the world, which is still the US. And that will be made worse by the tariff discussion, and that discussion will sort of have a ratchet effect on each other and spiral each other up. And that is a very horrifying picture if you look forward. And something, because it's financial markets, which will not be as easily fixable as tariffs, where you say, okay, sorry, I didn't mean it. Let's postpone it for 90 days. If bond prices indicate interest rates of 6-7% because of fear of inflation, you cannot dial that back. And if you look at this package, and if it's true that there are provisions inside which make it possible to punish external bondholders, for non-American bondholders, then nobody's going to buy that debt anymore. And that is much more consequential because it will ultimately lost to the position of financial leadership in the world, which I at least would have thought would never happen in my lifetime of the US. But that has the power to erode that kind of leadership.
Dan, your thoughts on that? Yeah.
That linkage of the tariff and trade policy and the fiscal policy with the tax bill, I think, is something new. I mean, in the Reagan
but I'm bringing it up because it's new.
Yep. No, it's. I think it's something that we need to think through. In the Reagan years, people were obsessed about the budget deficit, and are we going to crowd out the private sector in debt markets? Well, that fear never manifested, and then we didn't hear it for several decades. Now, the deficit and the crowding out, what it's doing to our bondholders from abroad because they're getting abused on trade policy, comes back to center stage. And in the tax bill, the fundamentals of it, keeping the U.S. corporate rate 21%, excellent. That's a key element of our competitiveness, and just compare and contrast it throughout Europe. And number two, not any tax cuts for the rich or all of the stuff that the progressives like to talk about on the mainstream media. It's preserving the tax cuts. It's preserving the tax rates of 2017, his first tax bill. And that generated more revenue than was projected by the Congressional Budget Office. So again, whose estimates are you using? Now, there's a lot of other things.
Let's take Jamie Dimon, the CEO of America's biggest and most important bank on Wall Street. He is signaling quite loudly very serious concerns about the Trump tax bill, putting a kind of overwhelming duress, a tipping point, if you like, for this $36 trillion $36 trillion sovereign debt that the U.S. is carrying, and they will add another 3 or 4 trillion in the next decade. I mean, is this something, looking forward, do you expect, Dan, that the Congress or the Senate will put any sort of curtailing weight on their ratification of the bill to sort of suppress some of these concerns?
Well, Sean, we like to call it a tax bill, but it's a budget bill. I think our problem, since I came as a young guy with no gray hair to Washington, D.C. in 1986, is not that we're undertaxing, we're spending too much. Now, the challenges are, and they tried to make some reform on Medicare, which is not for Medicaid, which is not for the old, but for those that are the poorer, requirements like you need to work or you need to try to work. So they've tried to bring in some of the benefit reforms, but defense is a big number, and that's defense and how much we spend on interest. We're almost to the tipping point. What I believe the tipping point is when we spend more on interest than we spend on national defense. What does that mean to the future of America? Now, should we spend more on defense? The world is quite unstable and dangerous today than it was 5 years ago. So those are tough questions. But I think it's important that we're spending too much. It's not that we're undertaxing.
Christoph, just on that point, Christoph, when we think about this bill and the stress it's bringing or could bring looking forward into the coming months as it comes to its sort of final wrapping up, where is there an intersection for the energy markets as we look forward? This greater fiscal fracture in the world's biggest oil-consuming nation, seemingly disregarding the signals from the bond markets, from the likes of Jamie Dimon, marching ahead. How should the oil markets be impacted? How should they prepare?
Well, the oil markets by themselves, without any of these economic warning signs, as I've been saying now for a long time, are at the verge of getting into a situation of peak oil demand or plateau. Don't think of a dramatic event, but demand slowing to the extent that the markets are no longer growing with all these consequences we have discussed many times. So it surely pays more than in the past to pay close attention to what happens on the global macro and growth side. And here are just 2 points I'd like to make. First, I think Dan is right, it's an expenditure problem. But if your own, and we don't know what happens and all the rest of it, but if your own congressional budget institution forecasts a deficit of higher than 9%, and you know that these forecasts are usually being trumped on the upside, not on the side of prudence, then it's really time to get worried. And the other thing is we have to be a bit cautious. One essential message of Jamie Dimon is not only this is going to hell in hell very fast, but it was, I just don't know whether it will be a tipping point or a breaking point of the system next month or in 6 years. And that's very, very true, because these kind of dynamics when it comes to bond prices depend a lot of expectations. And we still have also the Senate, which has to go and which may take out hopefully some of the worst provisions of this budget bill. So there is no cause for immediate alarm now and saying this is all done and dusted. But it certainly is a trajectory which, together with the tariff whipsaw, is not boding very well for the global economy. And what it will lead to is increasing fragmentation. And that, as Dan can explain to you, might be a good thing when globalization doesn't disappear and is replaced by regional alliances and all the rest of it. But in terms of global economic growth, it's a step back, and that is the bridge to energy markets. In terms of oil demand, then also it will be a step back.
Well, and just looking, okay.
I don't want to make this too much about the U.S. In that bill, but I'm hoping Jamie Dimon might be a horse whisperer to President Trump on what needs to be done to fuel economic growth. That's the way to reduce the budget deficit. That's the way to protect oil prices. It's economic growth will drive demand. Economic growth is what delivered the results in Trump term number one. And, is this a pro-growth bill? Are we spending too much? Yes. We're not cutting taxes really, aside from some fringe things on state and local, the tips.
But when you say, Dan, we're spending too much, I mean, it's sort of it's oxymoron in a way. The more the deficit grows, the more you have to spend. I mean, it's not like you can tax, you can cut taxes and somehow, if you have a deficit, you need those taxes to pay, or else you're spending more. I mean, tax cuts lead to more spending on deficit. It's 1 and 1 is 2.
Well, if they're smart tax cuts, they'll generate growth and will generate more revenue.
When was the last time that happened? Would you say that would be?
It happened in the end of Bill Clinton's second term. You had a wonderful convergence of.
That was back when you had black hair, I suspect.
Exactly.
Objection, Your Honor.
We had
this happened at the end of Bill Clinton's term because Bill Clinton first balanced the budget and was quite severe on that. So that was a recovery phase after a necessary budgetary adjustment. In the current bill, which we're discussing in its present form, there's no such adjustment. There's just a widening deficit.
I mean, starting with George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, they were all spenders. They're not fiscal conservatives. So we need to get growth back on the agenda.
When we look at the immediate outlook from the point of view of what might be identified, Christoph, the war in Ukraine, we saw in the last few weeks, month in review, that it looks like the Trump-Putin love-in is kind of broken down. Is that your reading? How does the month ahead look for that crisis and other ramifications that you would identify looking forward?
This is a really difficult one to tell, because watching this now for too long, I cannot believe that Trump would seriously get antagonistic with Putin. It just doesn't seem to be in the cards for whatever miraculous reason. And there's got to be a reason somewhere, but we don't know about it. And I think that Russia Putin itself is convinced that they long-term get the upper hand in Ukraine as long as they can neutralize the Americans, because Europe will not really decisively take action and take steps. And he might unfortunately be right on it. So I would see this continuing to drag on and not to stop until he doesn't get his 4 provinces at least, plus Crimea, potentially more. The Germans have a new government, Polish and others are very still sort of alert of the threat of Russia. But you look
big election today in Poland, a big election today, where a presidential election runoff today, whether the hard right or the liberal left might win that election, just in Poland alone.
And it's still hard to see, for a simple-minded economist, when you take the number of people living in the European Union and their per capita income, including on military, how they cannot stop this in the Ukraine if they really want it. But they have shown so far that they're not really willing to take the pain it takes. And so I would expect this to continue. And then the other thing, you're closer to that in the Middle East, I think, is also at the mercy of Trump. And it seems to be also Taco, so don't go too far, or stop here, don't go too far. And it doesn't really look like a coherent strategy, unfortunately.
I mean, I'm vexed with, one, I'm troubled with the continued bloodshed, and I think those numbers are underreported. But this is an ideology of President Putin. How do you negotiate with someone over ideology? And then, this could be a topic for a future podcast on a very scary topic. What about this part of the world where I'm sitting now? Does Russia want to take a bite of the top? Do they want to take a bite of the whole West? From Russia all the way down to Turkmenistan? And effectively bite off.
What is the feeling in Kazakhstan? Do they want the Russians to prevail in Ukraine, or they want the Ukrainians to keep fighting?
Same. President Tokayev's words from February 22 to today is respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. The words are there. He said it to Putin privately. He said it publicly sitting on a stage in St. Petersburg with them. He said it on Thursday here in Astana. There are some that are not saying if here privately. They're saying when, and then how much. It's frightening. And you think, if Putin really wants to poke a finger in the eye of the U.S. and Europe, well, bite off our projects. Tengiz, Karachaganak, the Kashagan. That's frightening. I think it's a low probability, but for the first time, I've heard people whispering about those types of things.
It's not the first time.
We just might wrap. Sorry, Christoph, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that words to that effect have been uttered by Putin a few years ago already. And the problem is not only ideology, it's also ethnicity. So the north of Kazakhstan is ethnically Russian. And when you have this mix of ethnicity, nationalism, and ideology, then anything may happen. And I agree, it would be a low probability but high impact event if that were to happen.
And you've heard some provocative State Duma deputies throw this around too.
If we might just conclude where we started, Christoph, which is the OPEC Plus decision to continue to increase supply, which inevitably you would expect tomorrow morning when the oil markets open, although a lot of it was priced in, that will continue on a softer, bearish tone of the oil markets, the oil price and the outlook for the oil price in the second half of the year. What does immediate impact can that have on oil production? Dan mentioned all these wonderful companies operating in Kazakhstan, but putting money in the ground to build new capacity. Yes, the Gulf states may continue to do it, but where do you think the impact of this cycle will be across the US, the Americas, and elsewhere?
That, I think, is a really important point to understand. The immediate impact will be very minuscule. because most of the oil projects are long-term, and think about Deepwater, that's one extreme. They will not certainly stop producing just because of temporary low prices. But also, very importantly, what people think that shale will go down and all of that, that is not correct, because we know historically that in the oil business, cost follows prices. So every time we have a price cycle going down, the costs for steel, rig rates, for labor, truck drives, everything goes down, follows it with a lag. But onshore in the US, that lag is the shortest in the world because they have the best infrastructure in the world. So it's only a matter of maybe 15 months or so. And I tell you, just look at the balance sheets of big oil companies at their profit and loss accounts. They make the same rate of return ultimately at $200 oil as they make at $20 oil. And the secret to that is the adjustment on the cost side which take place. So this will be a painful adjustment, but in terms of production, it will be decided by those who can ultimately outperform the others the most, and that's the low-cost producers in the Gulf and elsewhere. But before it comes to crunch time, we will have to have prices fall dramatically more.
But Dan, Sean, same question to you, please. Yeah.
Yeah, as Christoph was answering, I was trying to reconcile this OPEC announcement and what may be the Trump administration response. How does this reconcile with the National Energy Dominance Council, created by the president, headed by the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Interior, because Interior oversees public lands and permitting, things like that. And the whole purpose of this council, as the president stated in many addresses, is energy independence and energy dominance. And it really is to prioritize energy production over net zero. How is it going to now? Politically, low oil prices are great. Starting in the summer, Americans like to drive. The president has trumpeted the lowest oil prices in 5 years, the lowest petrol prices. So there's a lot of contradictions, just like there is on the trade. But the one thing that gives me some optimism and confidence is as I sit here in Kazakhstan and we talk about the middle corridor. So there's no question the uncertainty, the whiplash of the Trump tariffs has caused globalization to stumble. It's not going away, it's not dead, but it's stumbling. At the same time, regional economic integration or coordination, cooperation, whatever word you want, regional economic integration is thriving. And Christoph used the word a moment ago about fragmentation. Yes, that is true. Now, we used to think that was a bad thing, but all of a sudden, I believe it's a good thing, and it's a sensible way forward for these countries to continue to trade and grow their trade without thinking about the U.S. tariffs.
Dan, just to quickly conclude on the impact of all of this, both the whiplash and the OPEC plus policies to lower the price threshold of oil, and the relationship between all of those companies you mentioned. Let's sum it up by using the word Houston, Texas, and Trump, all big supporters of Trump in the election. Chevron losing out in Venezuela, the U.S. oil company is losing out with Trump policies so far. Are they happy? Are they is this what they kind of expected? How do you see that relationship and the wins and losses of that?
Well, much like the tech sector, it's even though they were sitting there in the Congress as the president was inaugurated, front row seats, but it's a mixed bag. They don't love everything. And I think you can clearly say, maybe unlike George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, Donald Trump is not bought and paid for by America's oil companies.
Well, that certainly seems to be the case at the moment, and we're going to have to leave it out there. I don't know if that's our headline, but nonetheless, it's certainly one for thought, because will he have whiplash on delivering a golden goose for America's oil companies at some point, or is this the status quo that they have to get used to? $60 Brent, and as Christoph says, they knew how to operate in that price point in the past and make lots of money. Will they adjust quickly enough to keep those profit margins? probability, you'd say. They've done it so many times before, they will again. Daniel Witt, president of the International Tax and Investment Center, the world's best golfer. Thank you so much. Aspiration. We live in hope. We live in hope. Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center of Global and Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christoph, thank you as always for being here on the first Sunday of every month and showing us some insights on where the world has been and where it could go with regards to the energy markets. Really appreciate it, you guys. Take care and have a great month ahead.